Hi, my name is Peyton Knight, and the case study that I chose was the case study of the meatpacking industry in the early 1900s um, through the lens of the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And the reason I chose this for a number of reasons. One of the main ones is that it translates to modern anxieties about administrative ethics and administrative evil in a factory setting, and it kind of transcends time in that way. Another reason why I chose The Jungle by Upton Sinclair was it has a lot of interesting facts about it. One of them being that it was written as a novel instead of like a journalistic expose, which is really interesting because you would think, because he went and stayed 7 weeks. Upton Sinclair traveled to the Chicago stockyards for 7 weeks to live amongst the meat packers and live in the stockyards and really experience the lifestyles of these individuals. And so one of the first questions that I thought to myself when reading this book was, why didn't he write a journalistic expose, or why didn't he publish a journal about it instead of writing a novel? And one of the main reasons that he published it as a novel is because novelists at the time were experiencing like an unprecedented amount of success in the way that the people were reading them, and they were able to change things. A lot of novels were written at the time as a means to as a lens to look through life and events that were happening in these time periods, and people were taking what they were saying as fact, because a lot of it was fact. A lot of them were muckrakers, as Theodore Roosevelt coined them. And they went and experienced these really hardships and hard parts of life that nobody else wanted to experience, and a lot of people really took what they said to be the truth because it was. And they were experiencing an amount of success that was kind of unparalleled before their time and after their time, because this was before the advent of major technology such as like the radio, which would change, and they didn't have to fight with other media styles as far as TV and other forms of technology that would later take on the brunt of people's attention. And so that's why this was written more as a novel, even though all the events that happen in this book are factual and independently identifiable outside of the book. And some of the horrid things that took place, which most people would hope is a work of fiction, is actually completely true. And that Upton Sinclair either saw why he was in the meatpacking district, or was told to him through people that he interviewed and talked to his 7 weeks amongst them. Another reason why I chose this case study out of all the ones I could have chose was because it presents a very interesting instance of, or one of the very first instances, I should say, of a novel having such a profound impact outside of its literary context. And what I mean by this is that after the American populace read this book, and a profound number of people read this book, including Theodore Roosevelt, he ordered an investigation of the meatpacking industry. So there was a lot of like federal investigation that went around, and conducted their own personal investigations, and found that most of the stories and the filth and the uncleanly nature and the exploitation of workers that was written about in the jungle was actually true. And so this horrified American people, not really around the means of the exploitation of workers, which is kind of what Sinclair was aiming at, but the uncleanliness and unhealthiness of the facilities that the meat that was, the majority of Americans were consuming was being produced in. And so this saw the passage of the the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. This is one of the very first instances, like I said, of a novel having such an impact where it prompted federal investigation, the passage of actual laws and acts over an industry. I found it particularly funny that Upton Sinclair himself quipped that he was aiming for the hearts of Americans but missed and hit their stomachs when referring to how people were more upset about the unhealthy and unclean nature of their food as compared to the exploitation of these migrant workers, which is something I'm going to touch on later as what it relates to my analytic findings of today's contemporary context of the meatpacking industry and this book's effect on that and the case study's effect on that. So, and another thing I found quite interesting was the political ideology of Sinclair really shows through in a bunch of his writings, and he was a very prolific writer. He had over 90 published articles as far as being either books, pamphlets, journals, essays. And a lot of these had his political leanings or ideology in it, which was he was a socialist, and this came through pretty heavily in some of his works, which a lot of people critique that, especially being in the time period it was, around the time period of the Red Scare, and a lot of people were really afraid of that kind of like ideological worldview, especially around the time of, while this book was written in 1906, you have in 1918, 1920s, the Red Scare that would happen, and he faced a lot of criticism on that end. And one of his later books that he wrote about the rise of Nazism was had socialist leanings, but it still won a Pulitzer Prize. This book actually was not awarded a Pulitzer Prize, even though it was considered, because of its socialist leanings. To give some context behind the nature of the book and the meatpacking industry itself, the Chicago meatpacking stockyards were created in 1864, and they were up and ready to function within 6 months of them being constructed. And they were a booming industry several years after that, to the point that, Chicago grew in size to the point where it was housing, I think, around 250,000 people at the time that Sinclair wrote this novel. He mentions that in several parts and facets of the book. And another thing which really drives the context of the book is that Sinclair refused to sentimentalize the characters within his book, because a lot of people, or a lot of novelists during the time, tended to expand upon the virtues of the poor in a way that they try to get like the modern or middle class Americans to feel for them and feel sorry for them, feel pity upon them because they're so virtuous. Especially writers like Charles Dickens was a big culprit of this whenever he was writing novels, and several other prominent writers and novelists at the time had the tendency to make people feel bad for them in the way of them being virtuous. But Sinclair refused to write about poor people in this kind of way, because he didn't want people to feel sorry for them. He wanted people to be outraged and mad about the fact that these were human beings, regardless of them being virtuous or not. They were being exploited for the purposes of the few that make money off the many, and while the few were living in luxurious environments, and the poor were living in these horrendous housing environments that he expanded upon in the first part of his book. He goes to length to describe the nature of the way that Chicago was being built at the time, which is a trash heap. They would dump profuse amounts of rotten garbage into big. I think one of the sizes of the holes that he talks about, it was 2 blocks, took up the space of 2 city blocks, and it was just being filled to the brim with trash, and people were living right next to this, and all these horrible conditions and stuff like that. He didn't want the sentimentality of the book to take over the fact that he was trying to exposed the awful conditions that these people lived in, whether they were bad people, good people, they were humans regardless, and that was the message that he was trying to get across while writing this. And that was another reason he refused to give one of the main characters, Jurgis, from Lithuania, like a huge inner mind, or a huge inner conceptual mind frame, is because he didn't want people to focus on this character so much that they forgot the context that the book was being written in, and they didn't want Sinclair didn't want his audience to look to this main character as or be distracted by his inner thoughts to the point that they weren't focusing on the horrendous aspect of the book and the exploitation and the awful working environment and the conditions that their food was being produced in. So some of the major analytic findings that I discuss in my paper have to do directly with the parallels between the meatpacking industry in this time period and the meatpacking industry in our contemporary standpoint. And while we don't have instances, as in Sinclair's time, of whole body parts being lost in the production process of these meats, where there would be whole fingers, or feet, arms, anything like that would fall into a vat of meat and be processed and sent out to people, or vermin in the way of rats, insects, and other animals that would, or beings that would fall into the meat and just follow along with the production process, which all of those were independently verified, and all of that did happen within the context of the jungle. And while we don't have instances like that, or instances such as whole bodies or whole people would fall into these vats sometimes of meat being processed, and they wouldn't be found until days later, nothing would be left of them but their bones. That was one of the only instances that couldn't be independently verified. And the reason that it couldn't be, after doing some research, is because these heads of corporations and the people that ran these monopolies would take the wives of the men that were killed in these horrible accidents, horrendous oversight, whatever you want to call it. They would take their wives and send them back to the countries that they came from in order to keep all these instances of their horrible working conditions and the horrible incidents and accidents away from the people, so they wouldn't be able to tell people about the awful things that went on. As I was saying, even though you don't have these instances that occur to such a dramatic degree as they did in the jungle, you still have these parallels and the symbolism that shines through, that really relates to the findings that coincide with contemporary examples of administrative evil within the food industry and the meatpacking industry. As far as the symbolism, we can look to the assembly line that really shows through in the jungle, as the early 1900s were, you get the advent of the assembly line that comes through, and you get the compartmentalization of industry that comes with that. As far as further down in the assembly line, you might have something fall into the food, something that happens that corrupts the food, that later on, as the meat becomes processed and goes through these different sections, it's compartmentalized as far as each part of the assembly line. Everybody has a job that they perform. And so if something happens in one part of the assembly line, you might not know about it as far as it goes, keeps going down the line, because it's not your job. You perform your function at grueling consistency, and that's your job. And you get the same kind of parallel with these multinational corporations nowadays in compartmentalization. It may not be an assembly line, but if something happens in the food industry at one corporation, or not one corporation, but one individual company that could necessarily negatively influence the rest of the corporation. It may not be able to circulate to the rest of the individuals. Say if you have something, some administrative evil that takes place in a corporation or part of a corporation in Arkansas, it might not extend to like the main headquarters of the corporation in New York or wherever that may be. And one of the other problems that really shines through is I focus on the exploitation of workers, of migrant workers. And this is one of the heavy focuses of Sinclair that he was really upset about, that the people didn't care as much about it as they did. And you have these migrant workers that come over from a plethora of places, like for example, the main characters in the book come over from Lithuania, and they experience an extreme amount of abuses and succession of abuses from the point that they get in America through their experience with the stockyards and, you know, basically wage slaves and the likes of that. And that translates to nowadays you have people coming over from Mexico, from South America, to work in meatpacking industries or food industries that deal with the processing of the meat, and they're exploited to the point of just about wage slavery. One of the most prominent examples I can think of is in the movie. It's a foreign film. It's called The Golden Dream. It's about these three young individuals that come over from Guatemala, and they make their way to America to live the American dream. By the end of the journey, only one of the kids makes it to America. One sold into sex trafficking along the journey, and the other is killed in cold blood on American soil because they were walking across somebody's land, privately owned land in America. And at the end of the movie, the protagonist is in a meatpacking facility working. It really emphasizes the desperation these individuals experience when they come over to America, and emphasizes the extreme amount of exploitation and the awful working conditions, the awful wages that these individuals are paid, because they know, these corporations know that these individuals aren't going to go to the federal government to complain. They aren't going to go to unions because most of the facilities are in non-unionized states. So they know that they can abuse these individuals to the point where the average quitting time of one of these workers is 3 months in with these corporations, because of the long string of abuses they experience while they work there. And that's really what shines through in some of the analytical findings that I touch upon in my paper.